Oh, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. I hadn't planned on saying this, but we're so successful at this event that those of you who are having difficulty finding seats, we are gladly accepting contributions to build an extension to this room. So by next semester, we can have 200 people in here. But I do thank you for coming. This is an amazing turnout, and it really is a boost to us to know that you're reacting in such a positive way. This is part of the Doctors B.B. and Owen Bernstein Memorial Lecture Series. I'd like Dr. B.B. Bernstein to stand. B.B. is part of the team of Owen and B.B. Bernstein. Owen passed away 2 years ago, but Owen was the type of person that everybody who has to face an advisory board every other once in a while for a monthly meeting looks forward to having on the board. He was one who knew what had to be done, and he knew how to do it. And not only that, he was able to supply the financial wherewithal to help us do so many of the things we do at the center. He belonged to a very unique group. I want to tell you about this group. It has to do with a friend of mine who last year went to Israel for the first time on a cultural trip. And as part of that trip, his guide one night in Tel Aviv took him to the Markovsky Cultural Center. And they saw the opera La Bohème. He was so impressed with the opera, but he was even more impressed with the architecture, the lighting, and the acoustics of the center that he turned to his guide and said, "Was this center built in honor of that famous Talmudic scholar, Rabbi Joseph Markovsky?" He said, "No, it was built in honor of Sam Markovsky, the writer." He said, "Sam Markovsky, the writer? I never heard of him. What did he write?" He said, "A check." Okay? I bring that to your attention since there are people here or on staff who will gladly accept any checks as a reminder to those people here who have not yet sent in their membership dues. Please do so. We need this to your support for going on. Having said that, I want to tell you a little bit about today's program. And as a way of doing that, I'd like to call to the podium the president of Queensboro Community College, Dr. Diane Cole.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome. I know so many of you have been here before. It's a very special place. It's a very special program run by a very special person. In 1983, what was then called the Holocaust Resource Center and Archive was launched, and I was a junior faculty member here at Queensboro. Many years before, in 1974, just after my dad died, I came across photographs revealing the horror of Dachau. Before that time, I knew my dad had been in the U.S. Army as a sergeant, and he had served in the war. And I knew from my mom that when he came home, for several years he had nightmares. But I never really asked him. I wish I had, but I hadn't. His voice and so many of the other GIs must be added to the history documenting the Holocaust. They bore witness to the devastation caused by unfathomable evil. When this center was begun almost 30 years ago, I donated a set of those pictures I found among Dad's papers. They have never been displayed here. Until today, there's one in the exhibit. Our Kupferberg Holocaust Resource Center and Archives is dedicated to remembrance and to education. Its mission was developed by a group of advisors led by Dr. Owen Bernstein. He himself, an extraordinary educator. His legacy continues with exhibits and programs such as our student internships, which teach not just history, but educate people, young and old alike, about the dangers of unbridled prejudice and the need for all of us to safeguard human rights. We are appreciative of Dr. Bernstein's dedication, and I have a special welcome today for Dr. Bibi Bernstein, his wife, his partner, and a fervent supporter of our mission. Bibi, God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Everything we do here at the Holocaust Center always seems to have a family connection. 7 years ago, when I first came here, we opened an exhibit called Sosua. It had to do with the village of Sosua in the Dominican Republic that opened up its gates to Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler. And as a result, 700 people were able to escape from Germany. When we did that exhibit, we had on the front cover of our catalog the picture of a stamp issued by the Dominican Republic. And on that stamp was the picture of 4 refugee girls in their very early teens as a way of recognizing what the Dominican government had done. 3 days after we opened the exhibit, I got a call from a woman in Miami to say that her sister lives in Bayside. She went to see the exhibit, FedExed her a copy of the catalog from the exhibit because she said, I'm the 3rd girl from the right on the exhibit. Okay? Last year, we had an exhibit called The Lost Voices, the Holocaust in Greece. And we had part of that exhibit showing Jewish life prior to the Holocaust in Greece. And as people were wandering around the gallery, such as many of you did when you first came in, someone yells out, oh my God, look at that picture. That's me in a Jewish Boy Scout group in Salonika. This past summer, we had an exhibit, The Jews of Mamel. And the opening night, we had a large crowd, just as we have here today, and they looked at it, and 3 women came up and asked me if they could get that picture, or that picture, because they were in that picture when they were a young girl prior to being chased out of Germany. We have a similar family connection today. And I say, Dr. Cole, when we met Thursday to go over the program, I wasn't really forthcoming, so I'd like you to come back to the podium for a minute. And the reason being, everybody who's the administrator of a Holocaust Center always has to deal with an upper-level administration. And when I tell my colleagues the reaction to my administration and the relationship we have, it's met with one of envy. Whenever I approach Dr. Cole about a program, there's always a strong voice of support of what we could do, how we could do it. And in appreciation for that, and because of the family relationship, what we've done is reproduced the picture that's part of the exhibit in a memorial plaque to show how much we appreciate the work that you did and what your father did. Thank you so much. Now, how did we come about with this exhibit? A very good friend of mine and a colleague by the name of Professor Robert Macklis, David Macklis. You're not that good a friend. Professor David Macklis, a professor at the Robert B. Williamson School of Business at Adelphi University, and the international vice president of March and the Living, approached me about the program. And what he was interested in doing, because every year, and many of you know about this, David takes a large group of people, and when I say large, I'm talking about 15 to 20,000 people from around the world to Poland to visit the sites of the Holocaust, and then from there to a week in Israel. And what he wanted to do was to involve World War II veterans who were liberators to come with him to Poland. Even though the American GIs were not in Poland liberating the camps, he wanted to bring them. And when we talked about this, it turned out to be the opportunity for an amazing, amazing story. And the first person I sat down to do it is our scholar in residence. All of you know him, Dr. Rabbi Isidore Eisenberg, who is our scholar in residence, the curator. Because of a medical emergency in his family, he's not able to be here today. Happily, he told me that medical emergency has been resolved, but he's still there doing a lot of hand-holding. But I'd like to call Dr. Maklis up to give an overview of the program of the March and the Living and where we are at this point.
Thank you, Arthur. And it's just fabulous, the programs that are created here, and doing a fabulous job, you and the college. Congratulations. I'll be talking, not too long, hopefully, about the March of the Living, Survivors, and Liberators. I don't know if I need the microphone after a minute or two. The Holocaust is not just a Jewish issue, but a universal issue. Let us learn from the past so that a more just and tolerant society will evolve for all humankind. It's a nice phrase. Yeah. But I tell you that when the March of the Living started in 1987, that wasn't front and center their feelings, their concerns, or mission. They were concerned at that time about the aging of the survivor community. We're talking 1987, concern about the aging of the survivor community. And they wanted to develop a program that would bring Jewish high school youth from all over the world to Poland and Israel to remember the past and ensure the future of the Jewish people. That was a very, very limiting perspective at that time. In 1993, there was a dramatic change in the March of the Living mission. I very specifically remember a warm morning in June in Tel Aviv at the offices of the founders of the March, and I was asked, "Can you take us beyond the Jewish community?" I said, "I'm sure I can. Give me 24 hours to think about it. Until now, your mission has been relatively limited, although quite important." Came back 24 hours later, and that was around the time of Spielberg's Schindler's List. And I said to the chairman of the March, I remember listening and hearing that one of the motivations of Mr. Spielberg to produce that great movie was in high school textbooks, there's very little mention of the Shoah. And also, if you do surveys of people in California or any place else, of young adults, the word Holocaust does not mean all that much to them. So I then suggested to my colleagues, why do we not bring commissioners of education from all over the United States? These are individuals that are in charge of the state school systems. But I really don't want the commissioner from New York, New Jersey. How about New Mexico, Idaho, or some Yenenfeld type place? Where knowledge is certainly lacking. I said, why not bring these commissioners for a 5-day visit to Poland to join the 10,000 or so other people that will be with us in April 1994. Well, at that point in time, they asked me, do I know how to find a commissioner? I said, I've never spoken to one. But if you're prepared to give me $125,000 to fund the program, I assure you we will find the commissioners. This is an important program because of who was part of the program, and hopefully it made some impact on what gets taught in the schools. But believe me, didn't do enough. I had a dream at that point. The dream was that the March of the Living has to go out further and further into the universe to bring those on the program who really need to come on the program beyond the Jewish community. The dream was, let's reach out to students in the Czech Republic, Austria, Slovakia. Let's bring members of the Bundestag. Let's bring ministers of education from all over the world. Let's bring Branko Lustig. Maybe you don't know that name. I'll tell you a little story. It's really hot here. If you don't mind. Branko Lustig was on the march, 3-4 years ago. I'm delighted to say I had the pleasure of meeting him and inviting him to come on the march. Branko Lustig was the producer, director of Schindler's List. And when he went back to produce Schindler's List, he was returning to Auschwitz. Branko Lustig, during his 12th year, approaching his bar mitzvah, was in building 24 at Auschwitz. So when I invited him to come on the march, his first response was, we have to make a bar mitzvah outside bunk 24. Now, why do we do these things? The world does not know what happened even today. I'm not now concerned about the deniers. Believe me, I'm not concerned about the deniers. I don't believe I have enough energy or that we should invest our energy towards the deniers. It's a losing battle. Nothing will happen. But there are millions, tens of millions, millions and millions out there that truly don't know. And if they were taught, it would make a difference. By the way, I had the special honor in January '06 of organizing the visit of Oprah and Elie Wiesel to Auschwitz. My wife would have divorced me if I didn't accept that assignment, because she was a giant fan of Oprah. But there was a real, very special honor, because back then in May of that year, there was a 2-day television program. Did that not reach millions of people? And I'm certainly delighted to tell you that with close to 200,000 alumni of the march, today over guesstimates, there must be 40,000 other than Jewish people that are participating. And on this year's march, we're remembering the destruction of the Hungarian community. I again expect 4,000 or so other populations joining us. I'm proud to say today, yes, the Shoah is not just a Jewish issue, but a universal issue. Let us learn from the past so that a more tolerant and just society will evolve for all humankind. A story about a survivor before I introduce the Liberator concept. The survivors have always been the key educational component of our program. The students that come on the program don't just come on a trip. Yes, in 2 weeks they are 7 days in Poland, 7 days in Israel. But prior to the trip, for 3 to 4 months from all over the world, community, Mexico City, there hasn't been a Jewish high school youth in Mexico City that hasn't been on the program. They go through 15 to 20 weeks of training. So it's not just a trip. But then when they come on the program, and they're visiting Auschwitz, and they're visiting any of the camps with a survivor from that camp, they become witnesses to the witnesses, and they're ready to tell the story for future generations. Here is a story that occurred in Ontario, Canada, at an orientation session as part of the educational program. It was a Shabbat orientation session, with 200 youngsters from Toronto who are going to be joining the program a month or two after this orientation. It was a weekend program, so there were Shabbat services, and during the services, at the moment where the prayer, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, Shema Yisrael, Adoshem Eloheinu," right at that prayer, a survivor that was with the group, there were 4 or 5 survivors with that group named Amit, was in great distress. Hearing the Shema making him in great distress, one had to wonder what was causing that kind of feeling. He then came over to some of the chaperones and the students and told the following story. He was in a camp. He was in a slave labor camp where a young man escaped from the camp. Teenager. Because this teenager escaped from the camp, the Nazis took his whole family into the plaza and brought all the inmates, all the prisoners, to that plaza, and it was a daughter, 2 sons, and the parents, 5 people, and announced, "This is what we do to people who escape." Had the family kneel, and unfortunately shot the family in the back of the head as they were kneeling. But as this was occurring, these 5 people in the family were saying, "Shema Yisrael," as they were being shot a second time. So you could imagine how this prayer has impacted this gentleman's survivor. The students heard that. That's a wonderful story, a message for the students to always carry with them, to remember that never again will they permit such a thing to happen. Never again will they stand idle. Never again. Never again doesn't mean that we have the power to stop maniacs. But it does mean that never again we should stand idle when we see bad things around us. Later that evening, at the end of the Shabbat, they have the typical closing of Shabbat service, the Havdalah. And they bring Amek to the center of the Havdalah with 200 students around him. 200 students. And they have the Havdalah prayers, and then all the youth together, over and over again, start singing Shema, Shema, Shema Yisrael, over and over again. And then other popular songs of merriment, in order to try to impact and change these horrible feelings on the survivor's heart and mind. About a month later, he meets the students again, and he says, "You know, I was in synagogue this morning, and when the Shema was said, sure, my mind still, how could my mind disappear from that terrible, horrific event? But I was able to deal with it. You've changed my life." So in the March of the Living programs, the students change the survivors change the students, all to make the world a better place for humanity. So then one might ask, why did I approach my board in 2011, I guess it was, and say, let's bring Liberators on the program. The survivors have such a great impact. The students have always said, all the education is fabulous, but when we're with the survivors in Auschwitz, it's a different ballgame. So I told my people, look, just like the survivors are aging, the Liberators are aging even faster. And they, although Rick, you'll see later, is full of energy. But I mentioned that the Liberator would provide an incontrovertible and everlasting testament to the truth. You want to say the survivor is making up a story. Terrible thing to say, but people say it. You want to say the survivor has an agenda. Terrible thing to say. But we're running near the last opportunity to bring liberators to Auschwitz to meet with the students. And by the way, my experience from bringing the liberators, and my dear friend David Wadorski, who directed and coordinated the program in a tremendous way. I actually came to Arthur Flew 2 or 3 months into the program and said, Arthur, I need you to recommend a good person to do the administrative coordination and development. And he recommended David, and you'll hear from David in a few minutes. My sense was, we're talking about the average age of the people who came with us from 86 to 94. It wasn't easy to find the people. You know, are they healthy enough? Do their children want them to go? Is the spouse healthy enough that they can leave the spouse? And by the way, we invited all the liberators to come with somebody else so that they wouldn't be alone. And by the way, we had a doctor with us 24/7, and we had an ambulance with us. No joke. You're bringing 16 people, age 86 to 94. We had an ambulance with us wherever we moved. But let me tell you, all the liberators were heroes. All the veterans were heroes. But they were significant heroes deciding to come on the March of the Living from 86 to 94 years old and go on such a program, which is quite difficult in 5 days, making that round trip, and a very active program from early morning to late at night. So they are truly heroes in many senses. I want you to know that the students treated each and every liberator who came in uniform. Half of the liberators had the uniform, half we rented uniforms. And you can see some photographs in the exhibit. The students on the program, when they got off the bus, the liberators came running to them. The liberators loved the 16-year-old girls that came running to them. But these are students whose siblings have been on the march, who spent months studying, who have the tremendous feeling for the survivor, but it was the liberator that made the program for them. I'd like to close with a story about one of the survivors and liberators that took place in Prasov, which is a slave labor camp, a concentration camp in Krakow. The name of the survivor was Joe Mandel. My Canadian colleagues have been trying for years to get Joe Mandel to come on the march. And we pride ourselves in bringing as many survivors as possible so that they can tell their story and impact on the student. Joe Mandel turned us down year after year after year. Joe Mandel never spoke about his experience. Never spoke about his experience. Actually, the one thing he would say, from what we heard from his children, I was unhappy, terribly unhappy, that I did not get a chance to thank and take the name of the person that saved my life, the Liberator. But he then said, I was too weak and too hungry and I feel so bad. That was all he spoke about. He comes on the march finally at age 88. Sitting on the bus in Plaszow. One of the group leaders comes onto the bus and asks Joe, what camp were you liberated from? First asked his daughter, who came in from Israel. She was a physician in Israel. So his daughter said, I don't know. Ask Joe. So Joe says, Gunskirchen in Austria. So the group leader comes to Joe and says, please come off the bus. Mickey Dorsey, a liberator, is with us here today. And the spontaneous meeting of the survivor and the liberator with not dozens, but most probably hundreds of students around that event. Is that not a fabulous, emotional, spiritual learning activity? I'm hoping that maybe this year, we don't have funds yet, I won't take this as a funding, it won't be appropriate. I'm hoping that maybe we could bring a few Liberators back this year and have them go on the buses with students. If we raise the funds, we'll be able to do that. But I do tell you, the Liberators were true heroes when they liberated the camps. The Liberators were true heroes when Rick was in Normandy. The Liberators were true heroes when Rick went into the town to bring back the people to see what the Germans did. But they were really, really heroes deciding to come on the march at this time in their life. Thank you.
Well done. Well done. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, thank you isn't enough, but you understand. Our next speaker, it was sort of beschert, and for those of you who don't speak Latin, beschert means it was destined to happen. Okay? We get a lot of requests for volunteers, people who want to volunteer. But it's very, very unusual that we get a request from someone who's a volunteer who says, I just retired. I've had a lot of experience with government, which means he knows how to work his way around an enormous amount of problems. And my father is a survivor. I am a second generation. I'd like to volunteer at the Holocaust Center. That was the interview. The interview said, you're hired. Come right in. David Wodorski heads up a group at the Holocaust Center, our 2G group. It's the group made up of children of Holocaust survivors. And what they are doing for the past 2 years, we've been in a training program to prepare them to be docents for visitors during the regular year. And so when David Mackler said, I need someone to help me with this portion of March in the Living to identify GIs who liberated camps around the country, do you have anybody? It took about 3 minutes for me to say, yeah, here's David Wodorski's phone number, call him. I'd like to introduce David to tell you about it. David.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Arthur. And can you all hear me? That's good. As Arthur said, I was asked, and I met Dr. Mackler, and he gave me the opportunity to help the March of the Living do something that had never been done before, which was to bring concentration camp liberators as our honored guests on last year's march. My job was to find them, recruit them, and organize them into a group to travel to Poland and participate in the march. With the help of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington and the Shoah Foundation, formerly known as the Spielberg Foundation at USC, and many, many others, including Hannah Deutsch, who's sitting in the front row, and Arthur as well, we identified and reached out to about 250 concentration camp liberators. We offered them a 6-day, all-expenses-paid trip to Poland, along with a companion. There were rigorous medical forms and insurance requirements, and it was a tough sell. I often said to my colleagues, and by the way, I was the other David, we were the two Davids, and I learned one of the tricks in the office is to call up and just say it was David, and everybody thought it was David Mackler, and I got whatever I wanted. But that's an aside. Anyway, I often said to my colleagues, if you wanted me to organize a one-day forum in New York City of concentration camp liberators, I easily could have gotten you 100 people. But what we wanted to do, we ended up with just 16 liberators, 15 from the US Army and 1 from the Polish Army. And we'll talk about him a little bit later. As David noticed, the youngest was 86, the oldest was 94. Our liberators came from all over the country, but 3 of them were from the New York City area. There was an even split among the liberators. 8 of them were Jewish, 8 were not. In Poland, we stayed in Krakow. The city of Krakow was never bombed by the Nazis. It maintains its pre-war European charm. The Nazis did set up a ghetto in Krakow where 70,000 Jews were rounded up for transport in Auschwitz. In Krakow, we visited a place called Platz Zgoda. This was the gathering place at the edge of the ghetto where the Jews were herded for transport to Auschwitz. There were two side streets that led from the ghetto to the Platz Zgoda, and there were still bullet holes in the walls of the buildings there where the Nazis shot the Jews who didn't move fast enough for them. The Platz Zgoda is also a very short distance from Schindler's factory, where Jews came in hopes of getting a job and the protection of the legendary Oskar Schindler. We visited Schindler's factory, which has now been turned into a museum of Jewish history in Poland. Today, the Platz Zgoda is a large open plaza filled with empty chairs symbolizing the emptiness of the space. It's kind of an area that you walk through quickly. There are chairs there, and they are elevated and isolated from one another. No one sits on these chairs. We turn that emptiness upside down by occupying the square and sitting our 16 liberators in these chairs and surrounding them with dozens of high school students. In the course of one sunny afternoon, each liberator dressed in full uniform, the way Rick is dressed today. You get a better look at him in a little while when he speaks. But in full uniforms that belied their age, they addressed and answered the questions of several groups of students. The impact on the students was exactly what we were aiming for. It was an awesome sight. David also mentioned Plaszow. Plaszow was the site of the former Jewish cemetery in Krakow. The cemetery was adjacent to a rock quarry, and the Nazis desecrated the cemetery, ripping up all the gravestones and building barracks on top of the Jewish graves. They used the gravestones to create sidewalk, forcing the Jewish slave laborers to tread on the gravestones of their ancestors as they walked between barracks and their workplace at the quarry. How humiliating. By the way, facsimiles of these gravestones appear, unfortunately, without any explanation in the movie Schindler's List. After the war, when the Soviets occupied Poland, they demolished everything at Plaszow and built a World War II memorial. And here I was going to tell you the story of Joe Mandel, but David already told you that story, and it was an awesome event. And I happened to be standing there next to Joe Mandel's daughter, when all of this went on, when there was a spontaneous recognition of each other and a hug. And his daughter, like me, is a member of the second generation, and she just couldn't stop crying. And she's saying he never wanted to make the trip. And finally, when he wanted to make the trip, I didn't want him to make the trip. I begged him not to. I didn't think he was healthy enough. But he was right. And just thinking about the memory of that hug and that experience, that will stay with me forever. We couldn't have planned it better. Our second night in Poland, we had a special program at the Krakow Opera House entitled Honoring Survivors and Their Liberators. When the audience was seated, the Liberators walked in to a roaring standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes, and the Liberators took their seats at the back of the stage. Dudu Fisher was the featured entertainer, singing and walking around the stage, introducing each Liberator and shaking their hands and thanking them. The Liberators each received a special medallion, and I must say I blew it. I planned to wear mine, so better late than never. And here's the medallion that we gave to each of the Liberators. And we also gave them a personally inscribed certificate. Early the next morning, we had to line up for the march. The March of the Living begins under the infamous Arbeit macht frei in Auschwitz. The Liberators led the march. By tradition, Israeli government ministers, along with the Israeli ambassador to Poland, leads the march. We called them the suits because they were the only ones wearing suits. I think even they were shocked when they were informed that they had to follow the Liberators rather than lead the march. After a long blast from a chauffeur, the march began. For those of our Liberators who were unable to walk the 3 kilometers, we had golf carts. The first time in the history of the march that there were golf carts. The march ends at the top of the ramp in Birkenau, also known as Auschwitz II, just past the place where the railroad track ends and where Dr. Mengele sat to meet each transport, sending some to the right and some to the left. At Birkenau, a stage was set up for a ceremony, and again, 16 chairs were reserved at the back of the stage for our Liberators, the heroes of our march, sitting there in full uniform. There was a pre-recorded message from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the keynote speaker was Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, formerly the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of Israel, and at that time the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. At the age of 8, Rabbi Lau was the youngest and smallest survivor of the Buchenwald concentration camp and was liberated by Rick, who you will hear from next. Then there was the lighting of 6 huge torches. The Liberators got to light torch number 3 to another rousing standing ovation. And for those of you who picked up the booklet, you can see that there is a picture of this in the back of the booklet of the Liberators lighting the torch. I want to share a final story with you about one of my Liberators, Ben Storch. Ben, who some of you may remember, because I know you come here often, spoke from this very podium, in this very spot about 2 years ago, and I had the honor and privilege of introducing him. He was the only Liberator who was not a veteran of the U.S. Army, but rather a veteran of the Polish Army. How many people knew that there was a Polish Army in World War II? Okay, few of you. Well, there was. Ben grew up in Bochnia, Poland, with his widowed mother and 3 younger brothers. When the Nazis invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, his mother told 19-year-old Ben to run away and go to Russia. She was a smart lady. At first, he resisted, but when it became apparent that the British and French were not going to counter Germany's attack, he listened to his mother and he ran off to Silesia, White Russia, where he was captured by the Russians and sent to a Siberian labor camp. Not quite a concentration camp, but certainly not exactly a picnic. In 1942, the Polish government in exile created an army in exile, and Ben enlisted in the 1st Infantry Division, his ticket out of the labor camp. His unit was attached to a Russian fighting unit, and he fought his way across Russia into Poland, where he helped liberate 3 death camps, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Chelmno, where no living survivors were found. He then fought on into Germany, where he participated in the liberation of Sachsenhausen, where several hundred Jewish prisoners, mostly women, were liberated. After the war, he returned to his hometown Bochnia, only to learn that there were no Jews left there, and that there was a strange family living in his house, and that his mother and 3 brothers had perished in Auschwitz. In 1947, he came to the United States, where he's lived ever since. He prays and says Kaddish every day for those who have no one else to say Kaddish for them. Shortly before we left for Poland, Ben called me up and told me that he wanted to say Kaddish at Auschwitz for his mother, brothers, and other family members and friends who had perished there. Though I had no idea how I would accommodate that request, I guaranteed him a minyan and an opportunity to say Kaddish. Having had little time to think about Ben's request during our busy itinerary, when we arrived at Birkenau, I got a glance at the program, and I noted that the next to last item on the program was Mourner's Kaddish, to be led by Holocaust survivors. I knew the right person to approach. I went to Dr. David Macklis. The way it was organized, about 10 survivors to go up on the stage for the Mourner's Kaddish. They each had to recite their name, hometown, and family members for whom they were saying Kaddish. Ben was already sitting at the back of the stage, and he was invited to join the survivors. After all, he was not only a liberator, he was also a survivor, having lost his entire family to the Nazi insanity. He then led all present in reciting the mourner's cottage from the stage. Thanks to Dr. Macklis, I was able to keep my promise. And one final note. The program at Birkenau concluded with the singing of Hatikva. Like most of you, I've sung Hatikva many times. But can you imagine? There we were in Poland, in Auschwitz, at the gates of hell, at the top of the ramp where Dr. Mengele sat as judge, jury, and executioner, with 11,000 marchers from 35 countries all over the world, Jew and non-Jew, with 16 concentration camp liberators and many, many survivors, at the largest Jewish graveyard in history, with Israeli flags flying overhead. We sang Hatikva.
You can all see how valuable an asset our staff is and how valuable an asset our liberators are, how valuable an asset our survivors are. We had asked David Macklis to arrange a liberator and a survivor to come and tell their story. And we were fortunate enough to have someone who liberated a camp, who I'm going to introduce shortly, and someone who was liberated by him. You know, that's really something, that's really coming across and being fortunate. It was the Buchenwald concentration camp. It's very, very hard for me as a Holocaust educator to describe to students what it was like. My all-time number one hero, Edward R. Murrow, and many of you remember him as one of the probably greatest commentators of all times from radio, who then brought it to television, was in Buchenwald, and in his diary, where he was the first newsman to broadcast from a concentration camp, what he saw, he said the following. He said, "I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald. I have reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words." Okay? And that was probably from one of the most eloquent of all newscasters. I would like to call Rick Carrier up. Rick Carrier, a GI, whose uniform still fits. Okay?
A little tight.
Yeah, Rick was there to open up the gates. And Rick, please.
Thank you very much. One of the things I can start this with was when I found Buchenwald on my 10th birthday. I just turned 20. It was April 10th. I had no idea what it was, other than the fact that on April the 3rd, when Patton had cleared out and they captured a concentration camp called Ordorf, I was on assignment from that group, of Patton's group, to find supplies that Germans left behind. So I went up there to take a look to see what anything in that camp was. I took one look at it and turned around and got the hell out of there. I never saw anything like that in my life, because it was empty and it was completely wiped out. Everybody in it had been murdered. And scattered around in the woods around it were the dead bodies of the people that were in it. And then inside were stacks of them. And I mean, believe me, I just saw it. I said, there's nothing in there that we need. So I came back and I took my next assignment, which took me out to Weimar on April the 10th, on my 20th birthday. When I woke up that morning, I said, well, I'm no longer a teenager, I'm now an adult. Boy, I learned my lesson on that day. Because even today, when I look back on it, discovering Buchenwald and seeing the tragedy in hors d'oeuvre, and then seeing the faces and everything else in Buchenwald sort of implanted in me then nothing more than another event in the war. But after going along with the March of the Living and seeing it all with all the other people, and then meeting all of the people that survived from it, and one you will hear from today, just shocked the hell out of me, and it's still sticking with me, and it keeps coming up and up and up and up. It is something I cannot take away. I cannot remove it from my senses. So that's why I put on my uniform and say, this is the uniform of 9 million Americans who liberated people from Germany, who kicked the Nazis out, gave freedom back to the countries that we were in. And that was my mission today, just to give it back to the people. But the people were dead around me. And I'm looking now at a group of people here that had people that were there and were killed in that mess. I mean, in that hall. I mean, really, 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 really bad. But in any event, let me tell you a little bit about my experience. I was the first engineer in Normandy D-Day, and I went through that process very, very quickly. Although this right leg got caught in the hook on the door going out, and it threw my knee off, and I'm still suffering a little bit of kicking from it, but that's about it. But the rest of the war was spent when we left there, we went up into Belgium, and then we went in from the Ardennes forest, and I was following behind the troops there as an assault reconnaissance engineer looking for supplies for our engineer company. We couldn't order them from the States. We had to get them from wherever we found them. So that was my mission. So I got around a lot. But the reason I'm here today, and I still have all my fingers, was I was trained very well. The Army engineers taught me well, and my great-grandmother was a Cherokee Indian, and she told me I cannot have the eagle in my body when I go overseas. I can't have the ram, which is my birthday symbol. She said, you've got to get back to what really survives in a war, and that's you've got to become a snake. So snakes see what the enemy gets coming at them before they get, and they can bite them before they get bitten. And so as a result, as an assault reconnaissance engineer, I only went out and found my sites at night. And then in the morning, I would build in my nest like a spider and look around and see what was going after. And I'd watch the infantry move forward. And when they would leave, I would check out to see if anybody left. And I would go look around in the towns where it was just cleared up. And that's how I did my job. And that's exactly how I found Buchenwald. I was doing that, and I was in Weimar, and the priest, the minister, and the way we did that, we would go to a church in the town, because churches were always, the priest or whoever were in them, or synagogues, whatever, was always taking care of their people after a bombing raid. Well, those bombing raids really tore up towns. And so I went into those places first, because they were out and they'd have tables set with all the paraphernalia to give comfort to their parishioners. And I would go up to them and I said, do you know of any places around where there's any German camps? And in Weimar, the priest said, yes, we do. And I happened to have somebody to help you. I had a Russian prisoner there who was one of the ones that revolted against the camp, and they're in the process now of taking it over, because the commander took off with 20,000 Jews in a freight train 3 days before, and they're gone. But so they still have about 16 or 13,000 up there in it. And the people that work in the camp that are slaves are taking it over. So that was it. So we went up to it, and I got up there, and they got out and walked right up to the fence to see the fence where the other people were. And I was standing in the back of the parking lot, huge parking lot, and there was the main gate of Buchenwald. And it was Art Deco. Really beautiful. I mean, I had no idea that it looked like the biggest concentration camp ever built, and it had the worst record of any of them. So I waited, and I struck up there quietly along the edge of the woods, and got up to the gate, and it had a chain and a lock on it. And I was looking at it, figuring out I could blow that off without destroying the gate, because the gate is beauty, and it's still there. The gate of Buchenwald has not been ruined. It's because I blew the lock off from a chain around it, and I didn't tear it up instead of knocking it down. But in any event, when I was doing that, I get the owner of that place just overswept me right off my feet. I couldn't 10. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I was bending over, and I suddenly started to fall. And I just went down, and it all came out. And one of the things we engineers did when we were out in battle, we kept 2 canteens with us. One of them was full of water, the other was full of rye whiskey, because if we needed it, because rarely did we have time to eat or even do anything else. So if we really got into trouble and we got messed up, we always took and put a little swallow in our mouth, swish it around, and then swallow it. It was like swallowing a cherry bomb that goes off. Boom. You wake up right away. So I did that, and I woke up, and when I woke up, there was this face in front of me. It was a face of death completely. Big circular eyes, black, with little dots in them, with just a little glint on it, and vituperating sores all over the face, and really, and this gaunt look, and a smile, and a breath coming out of it, and the teeth were all rotten and ready to fall out, and these 2 hands on the bars were covered with scabs, and I could see little things crawling around them. And I got hit with it again, and I turned around to go away, and I looked, and there were my 2 people that I brought up there, and I saw one of them coming out, a person crawling out from under the barbed wire fence. The people that fought the camp cut down the electricity, and coming out of the fence were these people, they could get through it now without being shocked. And I looked at it, and I went over, and I had clippers on my belt for caps on dynamite and other explosives. So I pulled it, but I had clippers. So I walked over, and I leaned down, and I tripped out a hole through the fence in a big oval with a guy. And so the fellow that was crawling through it was very, very weak. And he stood up like this, and he looked up, and he held his hands, and he started to walk through. And he just walked up toward me, and I sort of backed up. And he was covered with blood bleeding from the cuts of the barbed wire. And 3 of his friends came out with ripped rags and stuff and gobbed them off. And I backed up like this, and I said, ooh. And then the priest came over to me, and the young girl that was with him walked over to me and said, and then right behind the main gate that I heard machine gun fire. So, oh boy, and I was the only thing I had was a Thompson submachine gun and a .45 pistol, and that wasn't nearly enough with that. But I thought I'd literally let them know that I was here, so I took my Thompson up, there was a full clip in it, and I poked it through the wire, pointing right down the dud, and I just emptied the clip, till the clouds of dust went up. And I said, it's time we leave. Let's get the you-know-what out of here. So I started to run back to the Jeep. The front of the clock was blown out, glass was on the ground, and I ran over it, and I got in the Jeep, and I shot back. We got into there. Gravel was spitting up behind us, and we got back to Weimar. I called the headquarters company, and they said, Carrier, go back. Buchenwald, stay there until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You'll meet a tank from a survey tank from Patton's army to meet you, and they'll come up there. I want you to take that tank up there and secure that main gate, and then the main forces will follow behind, and the rest is history. The next day was April 11th, the official date of liberation for Buchenwald, and the clock face was shot out, and it said 3:15, and that was the date. And I stayed in that camp for another 2 weeks. And I was the one, and I have pictures that were taken by Life magazine and others of me pointing to the dead bodies, and behind me are all these women and men from Weimar and other places with rags over their faces. And there they are, the bodies are there. And those are some of the pictures I have of me in that. And I want to tell you, though, what I discovered there is still alive today. Dictators are the one enemy we have to face. Not politicians can't do it. A dictator is the only one that can cause a Holocaust. There's no other way. Holocausts are created and managed and run by dictators. And they are the ones that have to be stopped any way, shape, or form. We've already done it in Libya. We got one in there. We got another one in Syria, and we're working on him. There's others around. There's 26 of them running in the world right now. And there's one bad one in North Korea. So believe me, ladies and gentlemen, when they say, remember the past to assure the future, you got to remember, in order to assure the future, you got to knock out the dictators. any way you can. There's no law that will prevent you from putting a bounty on their head and having anybody grab them and put their head on the platter and show it on television, the internet. Show those heads on the internet with a bounty on them, and believe me, they won't last. Goodbye. Thank you. Liberator. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. I really, really enjoyed it.
And he doesn't have a teaching degree. The next person I'd like to call is Irving Roth. Irving, would you come up? Irving is someone, when you talk about Holocaust education and you don't know the name of Irving Roth, it means you're a newcomer. Irving Roth is a neighbor at Temple Judea in Manhasset, the Holocaust Center. He's a director. But Irving is a Holocaust survivor. He's going to tell you shortly about his experience in Buchenwald. But Irving, in his retirement, travels around the country, college campuses, educational systems, telling the story of the Holocaust. And for those of you who have heard it, and I know many of you have heard some of the stories Irving has to tell, they're amazing because not only is the content amazing, Irving is one who knows how to tell the story. So Irving, why don't you take it?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. I hate microphones, unless they're clipped on. Good afternoon. Now, I'm sitting here listening to Rick. Rick blew the lock off the gate of Buchenwald. Obviously, I remember the day. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and 2 American GIs walk into our barracks. But as I sit here, I kind of get a panoramic view of my life. Suddenly, I came back to October of 1938. Like 75 years ago today. Where was I? What was the world like? I was in a city called Humene in Czechoslovakia. It was still Czechoslovakia, it was still a democracy. And the world, in many ways, was euphoric. Why? Because less than a month earlier, the Prime Minister of England flew from Germany to London and waved a piece of paper. Peace in our time. Euphoria. Who would have thought on that October day in 1938, and less than a month later, 30,000 Jews being arrested in Germany, Jewish stores being destroyed, 600 synagogues burned. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that a few years later, in fact, 3.5 years later, Germany and its allies would control all of Europe, from the Atlantic deep into Russia, from Norway to Greece. Who would have thought? Because after all, there was a piece of paper that said, we have no intention beyond the Sudetenland. Because all we did was come and liberate the poor Germans living in oppression of Czechoslovakia. Who would have thought that 6 months later, I'd be living in a different country, in the same house, in the same street, in the same town, called Slovakia. A fascist country whose objective was the destruction of Roth and every single Jew. Who would have thought that by 1939, I would get up in the morning, in the summer, walk out of my house and go to meet my friends in the park, and there'd be a sign, Jews and dogs forbidden to enter. The fact that I was thrown out of school because I was a Jew. But more than that, the day I was thrown out of school, September of 1940, that afternoon I decided I'm going to do what I like doing best, namely play soccer. That was my best subject, actually. Lunch and soccer. And so I go home, not going to school. After lunch, I figure I'll meet my friends on the soccer field. I get to the soccer field, and the coach tells me they decided they don't want any Jews on their team. Betrayal. Betrayal by your friends. Slowly, step by step. By that time, Jewish attorneys were no longer permitted to practice law. No Jewish doctors permitted to minister to non-Jews. But I need to tell you a story about Jewish businesses. They had to be Aryanized. Let me explain what that means. It means that Jews are no longer allowed to own a business. Here's my father. Big-time lumber business, producing 70, 80, 100,000 railroad ties every year, shipping them all over the world, even to England. And so my father, knowing this, decided to contact a friend of his, a non-Jew, Albert Madison. Albert and my father have been friends, since 1920, worked together. And so my father explains to Albert about the problem that he has, namely that the businesses will be taken over by non-Jews. Would he lend his name to my father's business? After all, it's a simple matter of writing down a few names, a few papers, signatures, an attorney, of course. And suddenly, Roth and Company becomes Mellencamp Company. A rescuer of my father's business. 3 months go by, and Albert comes to see my father and tells him, Joe, we're partners, I want half the profits. 3 more months go by, and he comes, books under his arm. He says, I've been examining the book, Joe. I like the way you are running my business. I'm not going to fire you. And so, my friends, it continues. Jews have no businesses. You can't go out at night, have to wear yellow stuff. All this is happening, but it is now 1941 and Germany is controlling all of Europe, and they begin to murder Jews. How? By machine guns. In Poland, Russia. 500,000 Jews are murdered in 6 months, but the process is too slow. So 1942, January 20th, is the end of the Jewish population, the beginning of the end. A group of people, scientists, engineers, chemists, military people, transportation experts, are convened at a conference. Their job is to determine the easiest and cheapest way to kill all the Jews, because killing them by machine guns is too expensive. My friends of the group sitting there, the brains of Germany, the most intelligent people of Germany, who love music, who write poetry, but law-abiding citizens in 90 minutes come up with a simple solution to the Jewish question. They'll build death camps, gas chambers, crematoria, and the Jews will be gone. And so in the middle of the night, on the Friday night, the knock on every Jewish home, of the 2,000 Jews in this small city, 1,800 are taken from their home into the synagogue, which is locked, which incidentally, unlike most synagogues and churches in America, has no bathrooms and has no running water. 1,800 human beings stuffed into space about twice the size of this, with no bathrooms, for a day and a half. After a day and a half, they marched to the train. Gone. I am not, because my father is still running Albert's business. About 3 months go by. My grandparents are arrested. We decide we need to leave. We get them out. And we leave to Hungary. After all, Hungary is a place the Jews are still at home. Why? Because the Hungarian government decided it's a crazy idea to kill the Jews. Use them. We're at war. Why don't we take all the Jewish men, put them into a slave labor force, and ship them out to the front line, let them dig the ditches, let them fix the bridges, let them dig for the mines. After all, the army personnel needs to be saved. The Jews will blow themselves up, and that's fine. But meanwhile, we are getting... And so the Jews of Hungary are at home in 1942 and 1943. And I'm in Hungary. Spring of 1944. The Jews of Europe are gone, except in Hungary. In 53 days, 437,000 Jews of Hungary are taken from their home into trains to Auschwitz. I'm one of them. I'm 14 years old. I jump off the train. It's nighttime. Against the black sky, I see flames out of chimneys. I'm there with my grandfather and grandmother, my aunt, my 10-year-old cousin, my brother on the other side. Suddenly, I'm separated from my grandfather. They're marched off. Those buildings with the flames. 4,000 people came on that train that day. 24 hours later, 3,700 were ashes. I was fortunate. I was selected to live. My brother was selected to live. 3 years older than I. You know all about Auschwitz. The hunger, the work. It left me always hungry and always tired. But my friends, Auschwitz was one other thing. And that's the fact that you didn't know what's going to happen the next hour, next day. At night we came back from work. Generally went into our barracks, got a piece of bread, washed up, went to sleep. But on some nights, we marched directly to the showers. And as you got undressed, you walked in, and suddenly you were facing a doctor in uniform who determines life and death. My brother and I survived. It's now January of 1945. The Russian army is 50 miles from Auschwitz. Death march. March or die. First day, bodies on either side. Second day, the third day of the march. By the time the third day was over, you couldn't go 50 feet not to see a body on either side. Fortunately, my brother kept telling me, don't think of being hungry, don't think of being tired or cold. Think of something more esoteric. Why don't you say a psalm? He knew it by heart. And so we arrived in Buchenwald. No food. My brother's taken away one day. I survived. Thank God for Rick. Because by the time he got there, I was all of 75 pounds.
Block 66.
Block 66. Those of you who don't know about Block 66, this is where all the kids were. There is a very famous gentleman from many famous people from there, not me. Rabbi Lau was in that block, in that building. The other one was Elie Wiesel. And there is a difference between him and me, and that is the fact that he already got the Nobel Prize. I'm still waiting. And the war is over. I'm fortunate. My parents survived through the help of some Christian people. The war is over. 300,000 Jews are in DP camps. They have no place to go. As you saw, the white paper was passed in 1939 in May. No Jews allowed to go into Palestine. That's what the British said. 75,000 in 5 years. In the DP camp. My friends, as I often say, I don't believe in miracles. I just depend on it. A miracle. May 1948, a Jewish state is established. The Sheret HaPleita, the remnant of the Jewish people, establishes a state for the first time in 2,000 years. But on that same day, 6 Arab armies attack Israel. Their objective is clear: the destruction of the Jewish people. In 1979, the government of Iran changes. It goes from a kingdom, if you will call it that, to an Islamic republic. First order of business, my friends, is the destruction of the Jewish state. And since then, they've been talking about it. Day in and day out. They supply the weapons to Hezbollah and Hamas. They're in the process of enriching uranium with the help of Russia. And they will tell you that the reason they're doing it is not for peaceful purposes, to generate electricity. Explain to me, my dear friends, how it is that a country which does not know what to do with their oil is going to spend billions of dollars to develop nuclear energy. If you believe that, there is a bridge I would like to send you. They talk about it vociferously. Fortunately, the world, for the first time, thinks about this whole thing. They don't want Iran to be a nuclear power, so we pass sanctions against them. Their rhetoric of destroying the little devil Israel and the big devil America has not worked too well. And so they decide it's not working. Ahmadinejad is not doing them much good because the sanctions do work. And so they turn to a new, what I call charm offensive. Their president comes to the UN. He speaks softly. He even speaks to the president of the United States and said, let's make peace. But the Holocaust, when asked about it, first he said, I don't know. I'm a politician. That's up to the historians. But the destruction of Israel, the eventual destruction of America, is still their mantra. My plea and my hope that we won't fall for it. After all, they just passed a fatwa, a religious law that does not permit the production of nuclear weapons. I'm reminded of the piece of paper that Adolf Hitler signed. I have no desire peace in our time. My question, my friends, will we have the guts to stop murder? Do we have the guts? Or are we going to fall into the same trap? My friends, it was possible to stop the Holocaust. It was possible to stop World War II. If you look at the newspaper of 1935 and 1936, there are a number of people who wrote articles in the United States, in the New York Times, in fact, and some other newspapers. Let's boycott the 1936 Olympics. Let's establish sanctions against Germany. But no. What's more important? Winning an Olympic medal? Even though it cost humanity 50 million people and risks traipsing through all of Europe in danger, or an Olympic medal. My friends, the stakes are higher. Because the weaponry is different. We must stop them. Their charm offensive is to lift the sanctions so the economy can boom again. My friends, tell the President of the United States not to fall for it. Tell the Congress not to fall for it. Because the objective is destruction of Western civilization. Only you and I can prevent that. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you, Irving. For those of you who would like, Irving has written prolifically, and one of his books, Bondi's Brothers, will be available. Irving will be here if you're interested in obtaining a copy. And finally, for our closing comments, I'd like to call on someone. Many of you have heard him speak here. He's been a guest speaker at the Holocaust Center on several occasions. Rabbi Charles Agan. Rabbi Charles Agan, as part of his very, very varied career, has also served as a chaplain in the United States Army. And Rabbi Agan, would you like to come up, please? By the way, we usually always have a chaplain to make the opening comments, but he had to perform a wedding. And Jewish law says the wedding goes first, no matter what. See, I remembered.
Absolutely.
Okay? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. President Diane Cole, Dr. Flug, ladies and gentlemen, as a former chaplain officer who served on active duty in the United States military, I'm deeply appreciative to Dr. Flug for this opportunity to briefly pay tribute to my chaplain comrades of all faiths who have served in our armed forces from the Revolutionary era to this very day. The stories of their service and sacrifice are legion. However, in keeping with today's theme, I limit my brief remarks to herald those chaplains who were there at the point of liberation from the concentration and displaced persons camps after the Holocaust. These clergy in uniform rose magnificently to the occasion. The work they accomplished for the pitiful remnants of European Jewry, for the survivors of the concentration camps, for the wanderers on the roads, is a story to bring pride to America, to the United States military, and to the Jewish people. I share with you just two examples. Chaplain Herschel Schachter, he's there. He was there with you. Yeah. Arrived in Buchenwald on April 12th, 1945, only one day after the 4th Armored Division had liberated the camps and the SS guards had fled. There were then 21,000 dazed, emaciated victims still alive in the camp, of whom some 4,500 were Jews. About 1,000 of those left were children from 3 years of age and up who somehow had survived the horrors up to that time. Into this place of death, crowded with misery, came Chaplain Schachter. I quote from his remarks delivered at the United States Holocaust Memorial Council sometime later. I quote, "I stood riveted to this scene for what seemed like an eternity, tormented within with searing agony. my eyes burning from the smoke, and even more so from my inner rage. I walked back from the crematoria toward the endless rows of barracks, still dazed by what I had just seen. As I moved about, bands of Jews were now following me, pouring out tales of woe, asking me over and over, does the world know what happened to us? What will now happen? Where will we go from here? End quote. Thus started a period of about 2 months during which Chaplain Schachter spent every day in Buchenwald. The medical corps of the Army moved in supplies and physicians. Chaplain Schachter took up other desperate needs. Problems of food, clothing, housing had to be faced. Most important of all was the matter of repatriation for displaced persons in general, and the overwhelming question, where would the Jews go? I could share with you similar stories from the reports of chaplains David Max Eichhorn, who ended up being rabbi in Jackson Heights, Rabbi David Max Eichhorn, Samuel Blinder, Chaplain Samson Goldstein, Max Browdy, Herbert Eskin, Eli Bonin, Louis Milgram, Abraham Klausner, and so many others. By the way, some years later, long after the war, Chaplain Klausner became the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in New Hyde Park, and I came to know him near the end of his career. I am honored and humbled to have been given the assignment by Dr. Flug of conducting the Holocaust Model Seder each year before Passover on this campus with Holocaust survivors and their families. Some of you have been with me. And the text we use is one that was written by Klausner and some of the displaced persons who had just been liberated. It's a very unusual document that they wrote together. It's available, and Dr. Flug can make it available to you. That's the document we use when we conduct that Holocaust Seder. I indicated at the outset of my remarks that I would share with you just 2 examples of the outstanding service given by the chaplains. And here briefly is the second. It tells of the hope the chaplains brought. Almost immediately after the liberation, children were to be transported from Buchenwald to France and Switzerland. Chaplain Robert Marcus was responsible for the first of these, selecting 500 children and accompanying the convoy to France. The rule was that only children under the age of 16 would be received. But the chaplain refused to separate the few families still surviving after the ordeal of the concentration camp. He saw to it that the few mothers and older siblings left were put on the train with the younger ones, which brought him the difficult task of talking them past the guards at the Swiss border, because there were supposed to be only youngsters. Well, when it comes to talking, that's what we rabbis do best. And he was able to talk his way through with the mothers and the older siblings. The people were then interned in Switzerland, but with the aid of the Red Cross and the local Jewish community, their future was arranged and the group restored to hope and promise. So this, my friends, is in brief the story of an unexpected and tremendous task which fell to the chaplains of the American Armed Services at the moment of liberation and immediately thereafter, a task to which they responded with devotion and outstanding results. May their names ever be for a blessing. Thank you.
There's really no more that can be said. Our speakers will be here. If you have any questions, please join us in the gallery to view the exhibit. Those of you who'd like to see Irving Roth regarding his book, he will be up here. And can I ask the photographers to come forward? And please, before you leave, take our catalog for this exhibit. Thank you so much.